There are faces that cinema does not simply photograph, it captures them, it preserves them, it turns them into myth. Helmut Berger had one of those faces. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, he appeared to belong to another world. A world of marble staircases, silk shirts, dark hotels, aristocratic rooms filled with cigarette smoke, directors who spoke like kings. 5 women and men who looked at him as if beauty itself had walked through the door. He was not only handsome, he seemed dangerous. Not in the obvious way, not with violence, but with the strange danger of someone who appeared to know that he was being watched, desired, envied, and judged all at once. On screen, he became princes, decadents, corrupted heirs, doomed kings, and beautiful men moving toward ruin. Off-screen, people often spoke of him as if he were one of those characters too. Too elegant, too proud, too reckless, too wounded, too difficult to save. For a moment, Helmut Berger had everything that a young actor could dream of. Fame, beauty, access, luxury. A place beside one of Europe's greatest directors, a life among the cultural elite, a name that opened doors, a face that cameras loved. But the gift came with a hidden cost, because Helmut Berger did not merely become famous. He was remade. He was shaped into an image so perfect, so seductive, so aristocratic, that eventually the image became almost impossible to live inside. And when the man who had helped create that image disappeared, Berger was left with a terrible question. Who was he without the person who had taught the world how to see him? This is not only the story of an actor, it is the story of a man who climbed from ordinary beginnings into the most glamorous rooms of European cinema, a man who became a symbol of beauty, scandal and decadence, a man who was loved, used, admired, feared, and finally watched as he fell. It is the story of Helmut Berger, the star who looked like he had been born for palaces, but spent much of his life trying to prove he belonged in them, before the downfall. Before the interviews, before the public appearances that made people whisper, before the final years in Salzburg, before the stories of alcohol, Feimge, regret and loneliness, there was the image, and the image was unforgettable. Helmut Berger arrived in European cinema at a time when films still knew how to make people seem larger than life. The camera did not treat him like an ordinary actor. It studied him, it circled him, it waited for him to reveal something. His beauty was not gentle, it was cold and bright. His features were sharp. His gaze could look bored, cruel, wounded, or empty within the space of a few seconds. He had the kind of presence that made even silence feel theatrical. To audiences, he became the embodiment of late European decadence, the beautiful young man in the final rooms of a dying aristocracy, the spoiled heir. The corrupted prince, the king losing his mind among mirrors and candles, the elegant figure standing at the edge of moral collapse. People did not only watch him act, they watched him deteriorate beautifully. That became part of the fascination. In photographs from his youth, Berger often looks as if he is already aware of the legend forming around him. He looks composed, almost disdainful. There is glamour in the way he holds himself, but also tension, as if he has entered the room with great confidence, yet is still waiting to be tested. That tension would become part of his story. Because Helmut Berger's public identity was built on a contradiction. He looked like a man who had inherited everything, but he had not. He looked like a man who had always belonged to the world of aristocrats and directors and private salons. But he had entered that world from the outside, and 5 outsiders who are invited into elite rooms often learn the rules more carefully than those born inside them. They learn how to dress, how to speak, how to stand, how to appear careless, how to make elegance look natural. Berger learned the performance of belonging. And for a while, he performed it so well that many people forgot it was a performance. Perhaps even he did. Helmut Berger was born Helmut Steinberger on May 29, 1944, in Bad Ischl, Austria, not in a palace, not in a family of nobles, not into the world he would later seem to represent. Bad Ischl was a town with imperial memories. A place associated with the old Habsburg world. There were hotels, mountains, formal manners, old buildings, and the lingering atmosphere of an empire that had already vanished. It was the kind of place where the past still seemed to have better clothes than the present, where a boy could grow up surrounded by signs of grandeur without owning any of it. His family worked in the hospitality world. Public accounts often describe them as hoteliers or connected to restaurants and hotels. It was respectable work, practical work. Work built around serving guests, managing appearances, and understanding the quiet hierarchies of class. For some children, that environment teaches discipline. For others, it awakens hunger. Berger seems to have belonged to the second kind. From a young age, he appeared restless. He was not satisfied by the life expected of him. The hotel world may have shown him luxury, but it also reminded him that luxury often belonged to someone else. He saw refinement close enough to study, but not close enough to claim. 5. That distance matters, because much of Berger's later life can be understood as a struggle against distance. The distance between the boy he was and the man he wanted to become. Between service and command, between imitation and belonging, between being admired and being truly loved. He left Austria young. He moved through Europe, London, Italy, other places where a young man could reinvent himself if he had enough beauty, nerve, and appetite for risk. He worked odd jobs. He studied languages. He took acting lessons. He absorbed accents, gestures, clothes, postures, and the codes of cosmopolitan life. He was not yet a star. He was not yet Helmut Berger. He was a young man in motion. And motion for someone like him was already a kind of escape. He did not seem to want a safe career. He wanted transformation. He wanted to become someone who could never again be mistaken for ordinary. But transformation requires a witness. Someone powerful enough to say, "This is what you are." And in Rome, in the 1960s, Helmut found that witness. His name was Luchino Visconti. Visconti was not simply a director. He was a world and aristocrat by birth, a Marxist by conviction, a master of opera, theatre, and film, a man who understood beauty as ceremony, a man who could make a drawing room feel like a battlefield, and a family dinner feel like the last hour of a civilization. By the time Berger entered his life, Visconti was already one of the great names of European cinema. He had status, money, to taste authority, and the deep confidence of someone who did not need to pretend to be cultured because culture had surrounded him since childhood. For Helmut Berger, 5 Visconti represented everything: the gatekeeper, the mentor, the lover, the creator, the person who could open the rooms Helmut had always wanted to enter. Their meeting has been described in different ways over the years. Some details vary depending on who tells the story, but the essential fact remains clear. Visconti saw something in Berger, and once he saw it, he began to shape it. He gave him access, he gave him roles. He gave him a name the world could remember. Helmut Steinberger became Helmut Berger. 5 shorter, cleaner, more cinematic. A name that sounded less like a young man trying to escape his origins, and more like someone already destined for posters, festivals, gossip columns, and myth. But Visconti did more than help him professionally. He taught Berger how to inhabit a kind of aristocratic masculinity, how to move through elite spaces, how to carry beauty like an entitlement rather than a gift, how to seem as if he had always belonged. This was the beginning of Helmut Berger's great ascent. It was also the beginning of his great danger. Because when another person builds your image, they may also become the foundation beneath your identity. And foundations are only noticed when they begin to crack. The film that changed everything was The Damned. Released in 1969, it was not an easy film. It was dark, lavish, disturbing, operatic. A story of a wealthy German industrial family collapsing into corruption during the rise of Nazism. Visconti did not make history feel distant. He made it feel intimate. He placed moral decay inside dining rooms, bedrooms, family rituals, and inherited wealth. He showed evil not as something outside civilization, but as something growing inside its most polished houses. And at the center of that nightmare was Helmut Berger. He played Martin von Essenbeck, a character at once weak, seductive, grotesque, childish, cruel, and terrifying. It was the kind of role that could destroy a lesser actor, not because it required simple villainy, but because it required exposure. Berger had to show beauty becoming corruption, desire becoming sickness, privilege becoming moral collapse. He did not soften the character. He did not beg the audience to like him. He gave himself completely to the darkness of the role. And then came the scene people never forgot: Berger, dressed in female costume, performing in the style of Marlene Dietrich from The Blue Angel. It was shocking, strange, mesmerizing. A moment that blurred gender, performance, decadence, and humiliation into one unforgettable image. The audience did not simply see a young actor being bold. They saw someone willing to risk his own beauty. Someone who understood that glamour becomes more powerful when it is placed near danger. After The Damned, Helmut Berger was no longer only Visconti's discovery. He was a phenomenon. Critics noticed him. The film world spoke about him. Magazines wanted him. The camera had found a new object of fascination. And Berger, who had spent years wanting to become someone extraordinary, suddenly was. But fame did not arrive alone. It arrived with a role to play. From that point forward, people expected Helmut Berger to be dangerous, decadent, beautiful, difficult, and excessive. They wanted the myth. They wanted the living extension of the screen image, and Berger gave it to them. Perhaps because it helped his career. Perhaps because it gave him power. Perhaps because the mask had begun to feel better than the face beneath it. The early 1970s were the golden rooms of Helmut Berger's life. He moved through cinema, fashion, parties, and high society with astonishing ease. He was photographed like a prince, written about like a scandal, desired like an object. Feared like a man who could embarrass anyone by telling the truth too sharply. He worked with major filmmakers. He appeared in The Garden of the Finzi Continis. He starred in Dorian Gray. And then, with Visconti, he reached the role that seemed almost designed for everything fragile and grandiose inside him. King Ludwig II of Bavaria. Ludwig was not simply another film. It was a mirror, a long, slow, beautiful descent into isolation, a portrait of a king who built castles, worshipped art, rejected ordinary life, and retreated further and further into a private world that no one else could sustain. For Berger, the role carried an uncanny force. Ludwig was royal by birth. Berger was not. Ludwig had inherited a throne. Berger had inherited an image. Ludwig tried to turn life into art. Berger had been taught to turn himself into art. The similarities were not exact, but they were emotionally powerful. In Ludwig's loneliness, Berger seemed to find something true. In the king's refusal to live normally, he seemed to recognize an impulse that had also shaped his own life. The film was grand and slow, full of rooms, costumes, formal gestures, and spiritual exhaustion. Some audiences found it too long. Some critics struggled with its weight. But Berger's performance remained central. He did not play Ludwig as merely mad. He played him as a man disappearing into the image of himself. That is why the role still matters. Because Helmut Berger understood something about disappearing into an image. He was already doing it during those years. His life with Visconti seemed to place him at the center of a rare world. There were apartments, villas, film sets, opera houses, festivals, elegant dinners, famous faces, powerful friends, people who spoke in several languages before dessert. For a young man from Bad Ischl, it must have felt like conquest. The world that had once seemed above him was now around him. He was no longer watching refinement from the outside. He was seated at the table, and yet, even at the table, belonging can remain uncertain. There is a difference between being invited and being rooted, between being admired and being secure, between being loved by one powerful person and being safe in the world. Visconti gave Berger extraordinary access, but that access was attached to Visconti. It was attached to his authority, his taste, his networks, his name. To the public, Berger looked untouchable. But privately, his position was more delicate. He had power because Visconti saw power in him. He had status because Visconti placed him near status. He had roles because Visconti knew what to do with him. That did not make Berger untalented. The talent was real, the performances were real, the screen presence was undeniable. But talent alone is not always enough. Some actors need a director who understands their mystery. Some people need another person to translate them to the world. For Helmut Berger, Visconti was that translator, and as long as Visconti was there, the translation was magnificent. But the golden years were not as stable as they looked. There were already signs of trouble. Berger's appetite for luxury was famous. He liked expensive things, fine clothes, hotels, parties, the rituals of wealth. He had entered a world where excess could look like style, where drinking could be called sophistication, where cruelty could be mistaken for wit, where emotional dependence could hide beneath manners and money. And he embraced that world with the intensity of someone who feared being returned to where he came from. He did not merely enjoy luxury. He seemed to need it as proof proof that he had arrived, proof that he was no longer ordinary, proof that the transformation had worked. 5. But proof is an exhausting thing to maintain, because every room requires another performance, every party requires another entrance. Every mirror asks whether the image is still convincing. Some people who knew Berger during this period described him as magnetic. Others found him arrogant. Some found him charming. Others found him impossible. These things can all be true at once. He could be dazzling. He could be cruel. He could be funny. He could be wounded. He could make people feel they were in the presence of a rare creature, then make them pay for standing too close. The problem with being treated as exceptional is that ordinary tenderness can begin to feel like an insult. And Berger, more and more, seemed unable to accept ordinary limits. Then came the illness that changed the atmosphere of everything. In 1971, Luchino Visconti suffered a serious stroke. He survived. He continued to work, but he was weakened. The imposing figure who had dominated rooms and sets was now physically changed. For Berger, this was more than the illness of a partner or mentor. It was the shaking of the structure beneath his life. The man who had discovered him disnamed him, directed him, educated him, protected him, desired him. That man was no longer invincible. Visconti still had authority, but his body had betrayed him. And once a godlike figure becomes visibly mortal, everyone around him is forced to confront what they have built upon him. Berger stayed close to Visconti during this difficult period. Public accounts suggest that the bond between them remained powerful. Even when complicated, it was not a simple relationship. Relationships built on love, power, art, desire, dependence, and age difference rarely are. Visconti was much older, more established, more secure in his identity. Berger was younger, beautiful, ambitious, still forming himself. Still trying to decide whether he belonged to Visconti's world or had become trapped inside it. There may have been love. 5. There was certainly attachment, there was artistic dependence, there was emotional gravity. And there was the silent fear of what would happen when that gravity disappeared. On March 17, 1976, Luchino Visconti died in Rome. For European cinema, it was the loss of a master. For Helmut Berger, it was something more intimate. It was the loss of the man who had made him visible. After Visconti's death, Berger did not vanish immediately. He continued to work. He appeared in films and television. He moved between Europe and international productions. He remained recognizable. He remained glamorous. He remained a name. But something essential had shifted. The world still saw Helmut Berger. But the person who had understood how to frame him was gone. This is one of the quiet tragedies of artistic lives. A star may survive the death of a director. A career may continue. The face may still be photographed. The name may still appear in credits. 5. But a certain spell can end. And when the spell ends, the audience may not know exactly what has disappeared. They only feel that the image no longer burns in the same way. For Berger, the years after Visconti became a long argument with absence. He worked. But the roles rarely carried the same force. He remained interesting, but less inevitable. He was still famous, but not in the same way. The industry changed too. European art cinema was shifting. The great age of aristocratic auteurs, massive historical productions, 5 and decadent cinematic rituals was no longer the same. The world that had made Berger possible was fading. And Berger had been designed, almost perfectly, for that fading world. He was not easily absorbed into ordinary filmmaking. He was too stylized, too intense, too identified with decadence, too connected to a particular vision of European culture. He could not become a simple leading man. He could not become a humble character actor without some part of the myth resisting. He could not easily start again, because starting again would have required admitting that the first life was over. And Helmut Berger was not a man built for admission. He was built for declaration. As the years went on, the stories around him became darker. There were reports of alcohol and drug problems. There were difficult interviews. There were conflicts. There were public appearances that seemed less like performances of glamour and more like exposure. The same qualities that had once made him fascinating now made him vulnerable. His sharpness became harshness. His confidence became grievance. His refusal to behave normally became less romantic with age. In youth, excess can be mistaken for freedom. In middle age, it begins to look like damage. In old age, it can become a cage. Berger had once lived as if tomorrow would always provide another party, another role, another admirer, another rescue. But tomorrow is not endlessly generous. Money became a recurring problem, work became less steady. The grand lifestyle was harder to maintain. The old rooms did not disappear all at once, they simply became less available. One invitation not sent, one phone call not returned, one producer no longer interested, one friend no longer willing to endure the chaos. Downfall rarely arrives with a single door slamming shut. More often, it is the sound of many doors closing softly. In the 1980s, Berger appeared in international projects, including American television. He played Peter de Vilbiss in Dynasty, entering the glittering world of prime-time soap opera. For some, it was another display of glamour. For others, it signaled a shift. The European art cinema icon was now moving through a different kind of fame, brighter, more commercial, less mysterious. He later appeared in The Godfather Part 3 in 1990 as Friedrich Kienzig, a Swiss banker linked to the Vatican intrigue within the film. It was a visible role in a major production, a reminder that the old magnetism had not entirely vanished. But these appearances did not restore the world he had lost. They did not return him to Visconti's Rome. They did not make him young again. They did not rebuild the artistic shelter that had once surrounded him. The public could still recognize him. But recognition is not the same as renewal. There is a particular pain in having been iconic too early. People do not allow you to grow normally. They keep comparing you to the photograph, the first image, the perfect version, the young face that made them believe in something. For Helmut Berger, that comparison must have been brutal. He had been celebrated not only for talent, but for beauty. And beauty is a dangerous foundation for identity. It wins attention quickly. It opens doors quickly. It becomes confused with destiny. 5. But beauty changes. The face alters, the body slows. The room looks at someone else. And when the world has loved you partly as an image, aging can feel like betrayal, not only by time, but by the audience, by the camera, by your own reflection. Berger's later years often seemed haunted by that betrayal. He had once represented an almost impossible kind of beauty. Now he was being asked to exist without the protection that beauty had provided, yet it would be too simple to portray him only as a victim. 5. Helmut Berger was not easy. Many accounts of his life describe a man capable of charm and cruelty, generosity and contempt, intelligence and self-destruction. He could be brilliant in conversation. He could also wound people. He could speak with elegance. He could also behave in ways that made others retreat. He wanted admiration, but often made closeness difficult. That is part of the tragedy. Not that the world failed a pure innocent. Real lives are rarely that clean. The tragedy is that Berger's gifts and his flaws seemed to feed each other. The very pride that helped him enter grand rooms also made it harder to survive when those rooms emptied. The refusal to be ordinary gave him cinematic power, but it also made ordinary recovery almost impossible. He did not want a small life. He did not want modest comfort. He did not want quiet adjustment. He wanted the world to acknowledge that he had once been extraordinary. And he had been. But the world is often cruelest to those who insist on being remembered exactly as they were. In the 21st century, the distance between the legend and the living man became increasingly visible. Berger moved back to Austria for much of his later life. He spent time in Salzburg. He also cared for his mother in her final years, according to public accounts. This detail matters. 5. Because it complicates the image. The man remembered for decadence, scandal, and aristocratic performance returned to a more modest domestic reality, away from the myth, away from the old film sets, away from the Roman rooms. There is something quietly moving about that. A man who had spent so long escaping ordinary life was eventually pulled back toward it. Family, illness, aging, care, practical needs. The things no amount of glamour can permanently avoid. The public, however, rarely allows fallen icons to become private again. 5. Once a person has been mythologized, even their decline becomes material. Photographers still appear. Journalists still ask questions. Television still offers opportunities that may look like rescue but often function as spectacle. In 2013, Berger appeared on the German version of I'm a Celebrity. Get me out of here. He left after a very short time for health reasons. For viewers who knew his early films, it was painful. not because reality television is automatically shameful, but because the contrast was so stark. The actor who had once moved through Visconti's world of opera, palaces, and European tragedy was now being watched in a format built around discomfort and public exposure. The public reaction carried a mixture of curiosity, pity, judgment, and fascination. People watched because they remembered the name. They watched because decline has its own terrible magnetism. They watched because fame, once given, 5, can turn into a trap in which even suffering becomes content. Berger seemed to understand attention. He had lived with it all his adult life. A 5. But attention had changed. It no longer arrived as worship. It arrived as surveillance. That is a different kind of spotlight, a colder one. One that does not beautify, one that records. Around this period, interviews with Berger often revealed a man still proud, still wounded, still unwilling to vanish quietly. He spoke of Visconti. He spoke of the past. He spoke of people who had disappointed him. He spoke of the industry. He spoke with the kind of emotional rawness that made audiences unsure whether they were hearing confession, performance, 5 or both. But perhaps, for Berger, there had never been a clean separation. Life had become performance long ago. The myth had entered the man. The man had entered the myth, and by the final decades, even he may not have been able to separate them completely. When he spoke about Visconti, however, something often seemed to change. The tone softened, the past became clearer, the anger gave way at times to memory. Visconti remained the central figure, the wound and the blessing, the man who gave him everything and whose absence took something away that no later success could replace. This is the emotional center of Helmut Berger's story, not simply that he lost fame, not simply that he struggled with substances, not simply that his career declined. Those things matter, but beneath them is something deeper. Berger had been built, in part, through another person's gaze. Visconti looked at him and saw a star, a prince, a decadent angel, a beautiful danger. A man who could embody the collapse of a civilization. And because Visconti's gaze was powerful, the world believed it. But when that gaze disappeared, Berger spent the rest of his life trying to keep the image alive by force of will. That is a lonely task. 5. To keep being the person someone else once saw in you. To keep performing for a witness who is no longer there. The audience may remain. 5. The cameras may remain. The old films may remain. But the original gaze is gone, and without it, the performance can begin to feel like a ritual for the dead. In 2015, the documentary Helmut Berger, actor brought renewed attention to his later condition. It was not a flattering portrait. Some saw it as honest, others found it exploitative. Berger himself later objected strongly to the film and took legal action against its director. The controversy revealed a painful question. Who owns the image of a fallen star? The filmmaker who documents him, the audience who watches, the actor who once lived the glory. 5. Or time itself, which strips every image down to something more fragile. For Berger, control had always mattered, control of style. 5. Control of status, control of how others saw him. But age and decline reduce control. They make the body speak, when pride would rather remain silent. They make need visible. They make loneliness harder to disguise. And Berger, who had once been one of cinema's great images of controlled decadence, found himself increasingly portrayed through the uncontrolled realities of aging. Still, even in the final years, there were moments that reminded people of what he had been. A glance, a sentence, a sudden sharpness, a flash of theatrical intelligence. The old face beneath the changed one. Some people are never entirely ordinary. Even when life has taken almost everything that once made them seem grand, Berger remained, in some way. Helmut Berger, not the same as before. Not untouched, not triumphant, but still marked by the old intensity. That may be why people continued to look, not only because of scandal, not only because of pity, but because something of the original mystery survived, damaged, yes, diminished, perhaps, but not erased. 5. In November 2019, Berger announced his retirement from acting after health problems, including bouts of pneumonia. He said, in effect, that he wanted to withdraw from public life. For a man who had lived so long in front of cameras, withdrawal carried its own sadness. It suggested fatigue, not only physical fatigue, but the exhaustion of being seen. To be seen had once been his triumph. Now it may have become too heavy. The gaze that had made him famous had become inescapable. There is a cruel symmetry in that. The young Helmut wanted the world to look at him. The old Helmut perhaps wanted the world to stop looking quite so closely. 5. Helmut Berger died on May 18, 2023 in Salzburg. He was 78 years old. Only days away from his 79th birthday, the news travelled quickly through film circles. Obituaries remembered him as Visconti's muse. 5. As the star of The Damned, as Ludwig, as one of the most striking faces of European cinema, as a sex symbol, as a difficult man. 5. As a damaged icon, as someone whose life had become almost inseparable from the films that made him famous. The obituaries were respectful, but obituaries are brief by nature. They compress a life into titles, dates, roles, and phrases. They say muse, they say decadent, they say troubled, they say legend. But a life is not lived in summary. A life is lived in rooms. 5. In choices. In needs that are not always noble, in pride, in fear, in mornings after applause, in long years after the phone stops ringing. And Helmut Berger's life, more than most, resists easy judgment. He was not simply destroyed by fame. He also used fame. He desired it. He performed for it. He fed it. He was not simply saved by Visconti. He was also shaped by him in ways that may have made independence harder. He was not simply a great actor denied his due. He was also a man whose behavior sometimes made opportunity difficult. He was not only a victim of time, he was also someone who fought time with arrogance, memory, and longing. And yet, none of that cancels the sadness, because the sadness comes from the gap between what he had been and what he became, between the rooms he entered and the rooms he ended in, between the world's fascination and the private loneliness that fascination could not cure. What remains now? The films remain. The Damned remains. That strange, disturbing, unforgettable performance remains. The figure in costume. The gaze. The willingness to go into ugliness without protecting his beauty. Ludwig remains the king among candles. The soul retreating into impossible dreams. The performance of a man who seemed to understand grandeur as both shelter and prison. Conversation piece remains. The later Visconti world, elegant, faded, full of rooms where people speak politely while emotional damage moves underneath. These films preserve the Helmut Berger that cinema needed. The beautiful, dangerous, unstable presence. The actor who could make decadence look not like pleasure, but like doom wearing perfect clothes. And perhaps that is why his best work still matters, because he did not merely decorate these films. He embodied their sickness, their beauty, their exhaustion, their fear that civilization itself was only a performance waiting to collapse. There is another thing that remains, a warning, not a simple moral lesson, not the cheap idea that fame is bad or beauty is empty. The truth is more complicated. Fame can be real, beauty can be powerful, art can transform a life, love can open doors that would otherwise remain closed forever. Helmut Berger experienced all of that. He was not imagining his greatness. For a time, he truly was extraordinary. He stood inside the center of European cinema, at one of its most glamorous moments. He worked with a master. He created performances that people still discuss. He became unforgettable. But the warning is this. If a life is built entirely around being exceptional, what happens when ordinary pain arrives? What happens when the lover dies? When the director is gone? When beauty changes? When money runs out? When younger faces replace yours? When the world still remembers the image, but no longer knows what to do with the person? Helmut Berger spent many years answering those questions in public, and the answers were often painful to watch. Perhaps the deepest tragedy of his life was not that he fell. Many people fall. Careers fade. Beauty fades. Love ends, money disappears, the body weakens. The deeper tragedy was that Berger had once been given a version of himself so magnificent that almost any later life would feel like exile. How do you live after you have been someone's king? How do you grow old after you have been cinema's dangerous prince? How do you accept a modest room after you have belonged to palaces of art, money, and desire? Some people make peace with the smaller room. Helmut Berger struggled too. The boy from Badischl had wanted transformation. He got it, more completely than almost anyone could have imagined. He crossed the distance. He entered the world of aristocrats, artists, celebrities, and legends. He became a name, a face, a fantasy. 5. But transformation is not the same as healing. Changing the outside of a life does not always quiet the hunger inside it. Sometimes it only gives that hunger more expensive rooms to echo through. Berger's life was full of echoes. The echo of Visconti's voice, the echo of applause, the echo of scandal, the echo of old photographs, the echo of a younger face that the world never stopped wanting back. And in the end, perhaps he remained caught between two selves: Helmut Steinberger, the restless Austrian boy who wanted more, and Helmut Berger, the cinematic creation who seemed to have too much and still could not find peace. That is why his story hurts. Because it is not only about decadence, it is about longing, the longing to be seen, the longing to be chosen, the longing to belong somewhere beautiful, the longing to remain extraordinary forever. For a brief, brilliant time, 5. Helmut Berger seemed to achieve that. He became the beautiful danger at the center of European cinema. He became the face of a dying aristocratic dream. He became the actor who could turn elegance into fear and desire into ruin. Then time did what time always does. It moved on, the films stayed young, the man did not. But perhaps cinema gives one mercy that life does not. It allows certain moments to remain untouched. Somewhere, whenever the damned begins again, Helmut Berger is still young, still dangerous, still watched, still entering the room as if the world has been waiting for him. Somewhere, in Ludwig, he is still the king lost inside his castles, still beautiful, still doomed, still reaching for a world too perfect to survive. The later pain does not erase those moments. The scandal does not erase them. The decline does not erase them. The loneliness does not erase them. Our 5, they remain. And because they remain, Helmut Berger remains too, not as a simple hero, not as a simple victim, not as a cautionary tale with clean edges, but as something far more human, a gifted, difficult, wounded man who reached the height of beauty and fame, then spent the rest of his life trying to live with what that height had cost him. In the end, Helmut Berger's story is not about a man who had nothing. It is about a man who had too much of the wrong kind of everything, too much image, too much desire, too much pride, too much memory, too much dependence on a world that could not love him forever, and not enough peace, not enough stability, not enough tenderness that did not depend on performance, not enough ordinary happiness to survive the loss of extraordinary attention. He was the actor who looked born to be noble, the outsider who learned the language of palaces, the muse who became a myth, the star who discovered that fame can preserve a face while leaving the person behind it terribly alone. And maybe that is the final sadness. Helmut Berger did become unforgettable. He got what so many people chase, a permanent place in cinema's memory. But memory is cold comfort to the living. It does not hold your hand. It does not pay your debts. It does not forgive your mistakes. It does not bring back the dead. It does not make the room less quiet at night. The world remembers Helmut Berger in fragments, the beauty. 5, the scandal, the films, the lover, the decline, the interviews, the final years. But somewhere inside those fragments was a man who wanted, perhaps more than anything, to be more than a fragment, to be whole, to be recognized not only as an image, but as a person, to belong not only to cinema, but to life. Whether he ever found that belonging remains uncertain, perhaps he did in moments. A 5 perhaps with Visconti, perhaps on set, perhaps in the gaze of the camera. 5 perhaps in the brief years, when the image and the man seemed to become one. But moments are not the same as peace. And peace was the one role Helmut Berger never quite learned how to play. So he remains where cinema often keeps its most haunting figures. 5. Between glamour and ruin, between beauty and pain, between myth and loneliness, between the applause that made him and the silence that followed. Helmut Berger had the face of a prince, the career of a legend, the life of a warning, and the ending of a man who discovered too late that the world may worship beauty, but it does not protect it. In the final measure, he was not only the star who fell, he was the star who rose so completely into an image that coming back down to earth became almost impossible. And that is why his story still lingers, not because it is neat, not because it is easy, but because it tells the truth about a certain kind of fame, the kind that gives a person everything people can see, and quietly takes away everything they need to survive unseen.